welcome to Zoom or WebEx from your office, and we'll talk a little bit more about the rules in just a moment. We're going to take a moment to introduce ourselves, introduce our staff, and before we get started on that, I just wanted to introduce Sadie Williams. Sadie is my second oldest daughter, and she is at the University of Kansas. She will be doing some interning for myself and Susan Humphreys. I just wanted her to stop in and say hello before she exits and does work. Thank you, Sadie. All right. And now we're going to go ahead and start with introductions. You can just introduce yourself if you wouldn't mind, and we'll start with Representative Owsley, and just say how many years you've been on this committee or another education committee, and one other item of your choice.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think I've been on education committees between K-12 budget and education 5 years, 4 years. Maybe somebody in the audience knows better than me. And what else do you want me to say?
Anything you want, Representative. You get one more thing.
I'm good.
Okay. Representative Hubert's online. Representative, would you like to make a comment? Okay. We'll move on to Representative Estes.
Susan Estes, concurrently serve on education and K-12 ed budget, and this is my second year on both of those. And I used to be in the classroom, 3rd, 4th grade, bilingual, a little bit of junior high as well.
That was more than one extra thing. Point of order. Sean Tarwater, I've been on education committee since I've been here, and this will be my 6th year. First 2 years was education, last 4 it was K-12 budget. And I like puppy dogs.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Patrick Penn, House District 85. This is my 2nd year on this committee. And I think the only other thing I'd like to say is happy birthday to my beautiful little 6-year-old Amariah.
Kyle Hoffman, the 116th district down in south part of the state. I think this is my 6th year on the budget committee, but I have done various things for school bus driver and a little bit of substitute teaching in my past. So thank you.
All right, thank you. I'm Christy Williams, and I have been on the Education Committee 4 years and chaired it for 4 years, but I am a former teacher, and I do have 4 kids, and one daughter is a teacher, so it's a pleasure to be here.
Adam Thomas, District 26, South Olathe, Spring Hill. My experience with education, I've been on this committee. This is my 4th year now, same with the Education Committee. And I have 5 children, so I have no choice but to be knee-deep in education 24/7. Thank you.
Representative Tim Johnson, my 2nd year. As a second career, I have been in education teaching. I kept it up, just renewed my license, and I've enjoyed that part of it. And this is a wonderful committee to be on.
Representative Stephanie Byers, the 86th district in Wichita. I also have 2 children. My youngest son is a teacher in Independence, Kansas, and I was a career educator, retired after 32 years in the classroom.
Hello, Representative Joella Hoy, District 17. I live in Lenexa. My son's a 4th grader in the Shawnee Mission School District, and I serve on the executive board of the Rising Star Elementary PTA.
And do we have Representative Wynn and Representative Landwehr? Representative Wynn?
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you. Representative Wynn, 34th District, Kansas City, Kansas. I have been in the legislature for 21 years and have been on education-related committees the entire time. I'm a college history professor for over 40 years, school board member 6 years, and looking forward to re-engaging with everyone this term. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative. Representative Landwehr? All right. That works. All right, committee, it's so good to have you, and I hope we get to know each other even better this year. We have lots of exciting things ahead, but before we do that, I want to make sure we reintroduce our staff here. I do have a new assistant, and Holly Brocksterman right here. She's in 286 North, and I'll let her introduce herself, and then please go around the circle.
Hi, I'm Holly Brox. Getting used to this. This is my first couple weeks here, and getting used to being a committee assistant. Excited about this, and I have 2 teenagers, so you guys all know we're in education at this point, but my daughter's going to KU in the fall. So nice to meet everybody. Looking forward to working with you.
Hi, I am Nick Myers with the Revisor of Statutes Office, and this is my 9th session, and I've been part of the Education Committee staff ever since I've been here.
Hi, I'm Amy Deckard. I'm with Legislative Research. I'm the Assistant Director for Fiscal Affairs. It's my 20th legislative session and my 2nd with this committee.
I am Rachel Smuchler, and I am the AV Tech.
And I am Gabrielle Hull. I'm the fiscal analyst assigned to the K-12 education budget. This is my 2nd session, first with education, though.
All right, great. Thank you very much. If you all would open your folders, and I'll just let you know that Holly will be providing you this year the weekly agenda. If the weekly agenda sums up the daily agenda, you only get one, like it does this week. Otherwise, you would also get a daily agenda with individual testimony names in order with their emails, so you have a quick reference as you go. But you will not receive in your folders the printed testimony. So that will be emailed to you, hopefully always 24 hours in advance. It will be provided to the public 2 hours before a meeting. It will be on the website, so that is available. However, if anybody that is giving testimony wants to provide Holly testimony ahead of time, or even that day, it will be allowed. If it's a hectic day and we're trying to pass out and it's interfering, then we'll hold it until later. So actually conferees have the opportunity to bring handwritten or printed documents, but they also must provide the digital. So that just gives you a little bit of explanation on that. In terms of research and the revisors, they will continue to provide hard copies for all of us. So if you are absent, it is your responsibility to come get your folder from Holly. Holly, are those folders going to be left in the top or bottom drawer? Top drawer. So if you are absent, your folder will go back in there, and then you can come up to this room and grab your materials if you want any hard copies. Otherwise, you can print them yourself. They will be in your inbox. If you look at the committee rules, pretty much we don't obviously need to go over these. These are unchanged, but just coming back to items 19 and 20, just reminding you that yes, if you cannot make it in or you prefer to be in your office, absolutely you can do that. But remember, when you're voting, you do have to be in your office without a lobbyist or another individual swaying your vote. So make sure that we can see the background of your office. For the conferee page, this is something that's difficult to enforce, but I would highly recommend that conferees, that they always put their contact information, their name, their phone number, and their email, especially their email on everything, and title it correctly. At committee, we are always extremely lenient for parents and teachers and individuals from the public that aren't used to this process, and so oftentimes you may get a piece of testimony without a name on it. We don't like that when that happens, but please be understanding of that. So the directions are in here, and remember to provide your digital copies always, and you can double up with hard copies as well. So are there any questions from the committee? All right, if there are no questions, we're going to just go full speed ahead, and we're going to start out with Gabby.
Good afternoon, committee. You should have 3 pieces of testimony from me. The first one will be on a grayish piece of paper with colorful bar charts. This is just a high-level snapshot of Kansas school enrollment for the past several years. Data includes statewide unaudited headcount, FTE enrollment, weighted FTE, as well as a breakdown of the virtual school, full-time FTE, part-time FTE, and virtual aid. It also includes at-risk, an overview for the past several years, and special education. The bar graph is highlighting those first 3 columns: unaudited headcount, FTE enrollment, and the weighted FTE. I am happy to take any questions on it, but just wanted to provide this for some background information.
Proceed.
Okay. Moving on to it's kind of an ivory colored memo. It's going to go along with the spreadsheet as well. This memo is a comprehensive look at our COVID funding. You've probably seen a couple iterations of this last session. This should be all of our COVID funding so far condensed into one memo. I won't go over the contents of every page just for time's sake, but if there's any questions, I am happy to answer them. We'll start on page 3. Just for some context, Kansas was allocated ESSER funds in 3 rounds. ESSER Fund 1, also referred to as the CARES Act, was $84.5 million. Kansas was awarded $369.8 million through ESSER 2 and $831.2 million through ESSER 3. The middle of the page has some context on the set-aside that was made for administrative costs. Under all 3 laws, state educational agencies had to award 90% of funding to local education agencies. Our state education agency is KSDE, and our local education agencies are the school districts. So that just means that KSDE had to award 90% of the allocation to those local school districts. Flipping the page, there's some more detail on requirements for spending, as well as a breakdown of the school district allocation, as well as the state grant and the administrative set aside for each ESSER fund. Under the CARES Act, and this is on page 5, KSDE had up to 1 year to award the 90% amount to school districts. The timeline was accelerated under ARPA or ESSER 3 to within 60 days of receipt to the extent possible. Any funding not awarded within a year of KSDE's receipt is required to be returned to the U.S. Department of Education for reallocation. And page 5 also lists the deadlines for obligation. So ESSER 1 can be obligated through September 30th, 2022. ESSER 2 funds must be obligated by September 30th, 2023. And ESSER 3 funds must be obligated by September 30th, 2024. Congress also had some planning requirements for ESSER 3 that are listed on page 5. The state educational agency was required to work with stakeholders to develop and submit a plan to the U.S. Department of Education that includes how the state emergency grants would be used. A portion of ESSER 3 was withheld until that plan was submitted and approved, which has taken place. Both the state and U.S. ESSER grants are subject to other federal law requirements, so those include cash management, pre-award costs, and some record-keeping requirements. Flipping to page 6. There is detail on the 12 allowable purposes under the CARES Act, as well as the 3 additional purposes under CRISA. I will note that the U.S. Department of Education made clear that these were also allowable purposes under CARES. They just wanted to highlight these 3 additional purposes under CRISA. I won't read through all of them, but they are there for your reference. Moving to page 8. Nick will be detailing legislation later this afternoon, so I won't go into detail during my presentation, but there is legislation and appropriations on pages 8 and 9, and I'm happy to answer any questions if somehow Nick can't answer them, but I'm sure he will get that taken care of. Page 10 outlines the establishment of the Commissioner's Task Force on ESSER. The task force was established by the Kansas Commissioner of Education to assess and make recommendations on applications for district ESSER plans and private school EANS applications. This page also describes true-up allocations, so I'll just draw your attention to the bottom of page 10. You'll see under ESSER 2 funds, true-up funding totaled about $11.5 million, and that ensured that each district received $300 per full-time equivalent employee at minimum. Page 11 also breaks down special education aid, allocations made for School for the Deaf and School for the Blind, as well as administrative costs. Moving to page 12, we have a breakdown of ESSER 3. The top of the page 12 details ESSER 3 uses approved by the state board in April, and that pie chart illustrates specific breakdowns for the approved administrative costs. Also on page 12 onto page 13 is a breakdown of true-up allocations by district. I will note that these districts are also the ones highlighted in pink on the large spreadsheet I've provided. And on page 13, we have a summary of ESSER 1 and ESSER 2 expenditures. As of December 9th, 2021, our districts have drawn down $81.6 million of the $84.1 million ESSER funds awarded under the CARES Act, with $2.5 million remaining to be spent. That includes $74.3 million from the $76.1 million required to be awarded to districts, and $7.3 million of the $8 million awarded for special education as the state emergency grant. From ESSER 2 funds, U.S. districts have requested approximately $298.8 million and have drawn down approximately $117.1 million from district and state ESSER 2 funds. That includes $276.8 million requested of the $332.8 million ESSER 2 funds, of which they've drawn down $109.5 million, $12.1 million from the state ESSER 2 funds for special education. Districts have drawn down $2.9 million of that amount, and $9.9 million from the state ESSER 2 funds for true-up. Districts have drawn down about $4.8 million of that amount. By the November State Board meeting, 272 districts had submitted their ESSER plans for the task force and state board approval. An additional 8 districts had plans in progress. I will note, just due to timing, we weren't able to update this, but at the December meeting, they did indicate that 100% of districts have submitted those plans. Moving to page 14, we have a graphic showing expenditures for ESSER 2 by purpose, listed from largest expenditure total to smallest. And then on page 15, we also put together a chart showing the number of districts that included certain line item expenditures, such as premium, retention, or hazard pay, cleaning supplies, and staff salaries. And again, all of this data is included in the large spreadsheet put together. That one's just broken down by district. On page 15, we also have a breakdown of state level expenditures and obligations. State ESSER 1 funds were awarded in fiscal year 2020, and the majority were expended in fiscal year 2020 and fiscal year 2021. Approximately $1.7 million of the special education funding has been drawn down in fiscal year 2022 or remains available. Of the state ESSER II funds, KSDE expended approximately $1.8 million in fiscal year 2021 and $48,537 in fiscal year 2022 for administrative costs. And the chart below shows, as of October 1st, 2021, the funding has been spent or obligated as follows. So it shows a breakdown of expenditures or obligations by state learning loss, state summer enrichment, state after school, state discretionary, or for administrative purposes. Page 16 shows allocations by program with their corresponding colors. And on page 17, I will note of the ESSER III state administrative funding, $1.8 million was expended in fiscal year 2021 to contract with Boston Consulting Group to set up a reporting system for districts and other educational institutions to report ESSER and EANS expenditures. The bottom of page 17 and page 18 cover emergency assistance to non-public schools or EANS. Under CRISA, Kansas received $26.7 million through the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund to be allocated as EANS funding. The Governor appointed KSDE as the lead agency to award those funds through an application process. The window to apply for EANS funding under CRISA closed on April 2nd of 2021. And the state board reviewed the applications in a special meeting on April 19th of 2021. 72 applicants requested $26.9 million, which was slightly more than the available funding. Of the funding requested, $21.6 million was deemed eligible, which ended up being about 80% of requested expenditures. Eligible expenditures can be broken down into 5 categories listed, with the highest category being personnel and technology. There were expenditures for sanitation and social emotional learning and mental health, as well as curriculum and professional development. Moving to page 18, we have a breakdown of EANS 2 under ARPA. KSDE received about $25.1 million for EANS. Approximately $200,000 will be expended for administrative costs. 26 applications were reviewed with expenditure requests totaling $15.7 million. Of those 26 applications, a majority of requests came from smaller private schools, with 22 applicants having 200 students or less. And the state board approved expenditures of $12.7 million. I will note the original guidance from the U.S. Department of Education required that districts have a 40% poverty rate or higher to be eligible for these funds. KSDE requested for EANS 2 that poverty be reevaluated at 20%, and that has since been accepted, and they will reevaluate plans submitted to see if they now qualify under that new percentage. Page 19 through 21 detail maintenance of effort requirements, and page 22 through 27 detail maintenance of equity. There are maintenance of effort requirements for ESSER funds, GEAR funds, and EANS funding. We list out the calculation of how that's determined on pages 19 and 20. I will note that the governor applied for a waiver for fiscal year 22 for the higher education maintenance of effort, and we're awaiting a response from the U.S. Department of Education regarding that waiver. Page 22 starts the review of maintenance of equity. The maintenance of equity requires states to maintain funding for high-need districts at the same per-pupil level as the average statewide per-pupil funding level, and maintain funding for high-poverty districts at the fiscal year 2019 per-pupil level. And I will note that there is no waiver or exemption from maintenance of equity requirements for states. The bottom of page 23 through page 28 lists the districts submitted by Kansas Department of Education as high need and high poverty are in italics. And finally, on page 28, we review the other K-12 funds. I won't go into much detail on these, but there are additional funds that allocations were received through the Federal COVID Relief Fund for direct relief to local units of government on page 28. And on page 29, there was an allocation under ARPA specific to homeless youth. And then finally, on page 30, ARPA did include allocations for individuals with disabilities, and that funding is detailed on page 30. So I know that was a quick and high-level overview of COVID funding, but I'd be happy to stand for questions.
Excellent job, Gabrielle. Questions from committee? We've seen this a lot of times. Representative Estes?
On page 14 in the graphic, the second highest category was other activities. Could you elaborate on that, please?
I don't have a description with me today on what the other activities category included. That was data we compiled from KSDE, but I'd be happy to get back with you on that.
We're going to ask our resident expert in the room, Representative Adam Thomas, sits on that committee.
I believe other activities refers to extracurricular activities mostly.
Can you even go a little bit further on that?
I believe that's just
Like bowling?
like what?
Bowling?
Bowling, perhaps? No. Extracurricular activities, after school stuff that students do with related to sports.
Basket weaving.
Basket weaving may qualify.
I'm actually giving him a hard time. I actually, on that topic, I just with you, but I was just sending emails to Randy and Brad and Craig about the importance of extracurricular activities and actually at post or in the middle of a pandemic, kids getting out, getting busy, that's all good stuff. So I'm not opposed to it. I just kind of joking.
Basket weaving.
Okay. Any other questions, committee? Now, Gabrielle, we're going to go over the larger handout as well, or just reference it?
I was just going to reference it. It details the ESSER 1, 2, and 3 allocation and drawdown to date. So in the top, I will note that each has the obligation date. And there is a color coding system that I've adopted. The pink ones are the districts with true-up allocations. Yellow will be districts that, as of the December meeting, had new items to add to their ESSER 2 plans. The blue indicates that they changed an expenditure amount, and green means that they had both. But we will update this every month as districts submit.
Okay, I do have a couple of questions and maybe a request. Sure. So in the past, we've received these spreadsheets, and they've included local county money that's gone through Spark to the counties to the schools. Is that kind of absorbed in here, or is that not in here?
I'll have to double check. This one is ESSER 1, ESSER 2, and ESSER 3. So on the very far right column, we have retained CARES Act. The middle section is CRISA. And then we also have ARPA, but I'll double check on county money.
Okay, because it would be on next month's iteration, if you could include maybe those county dollars. Eventually, it'll even get a little bit more complicated with Spark dollars that may be coming out. And then the other question is, what about when the EANS is not on here? Could you make a separate one that showed us where the private dollars are going?
Yeah,
that would be
absolutely.
very helpful. And then the last request would be, because we're going to perhaps see these every month, if they could be dated.
There should be a date on the bottom right-hand corner.
Oh, it is. My
And
bad.
I will
It is.
change the highlighting of the title every time so we can reference a color, but
Well,
I will
thank
keep
you.
the date on
It
there
is there.
too.
Of course, you would not eliminate the date. Okay. Committee, what questions do you have? All right. Thank you very much for the overview. There will be more questions to come, I am sure. All right, so next we have Nick, and we're going to talk about legislative changes, and then you can go into any information that you want to highlight about the education article.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good to see all the committee members again and be in front of you again. Committee, the first document I'm going to be speaking from is reviewing our legislative changes from last year. And I just wanted to note, I will not be covering the appropriations that occurred in House Bill 2134. We can get any information necessary back to you if you have questions on those. So generally, there were three bills containing substantive education provisions that passed last year. The main one being House Bill 2134, the funding and policy bill, and then there were two others, House Bill 2085 and House substitute for Senate Bill 63. As I said, the main education policy bill was House Bill 2134. I'm going to begin with the provisions in that bill that relate to at-risk funding and at-risk educational services. Generally, as you know, the school finance formula, the Kansas School Equity Enhancement Act, provides additional state funding for school districts to provide students who are at risk of academic failure with additional educational opportunities, interventions, and services. And that additional funding is done through a proxy weighting, and that is determined based on free lunch students. There's another weighting as well. Instead of just the at-risk weighting, there's another weighting right now currently that is the high-density at-risk weighting that school districts can receive if they've got 35% or more free lunch students in the district or in an individual building of the school district. So those two weightings are how that funding is funneled through. The main crux of what House Bill 2134 did is it changed some provisions with regard to identification of students who are eligible for at-risk services, so in need of additional educational interventions. So what the bill did is it provided that the general purpose of the at-risk funding and the at-risk educational programs is to provide students who are identified as eligible to receive at-risk programs and services with those additional educational opportunities, interventions, and evidence-based instructional services above and beyond regular educational services. The bill stated in the law that students are to be identified as eligible for at-risk programs and services based upon certain criteria. This criteria came from what the KSDE, the Kansas State Department of Education, has used to identify those children. And I want to note that free lunch eligibility doesn't necessarily mean that you are receiving at-risk programs and services. So pursuant to the new law, a student is deemed eligible for at-risk programs and services if, and you can see on the chart on page 3, or beginning on page 2 and then carrying over into page 3, there's 11 criteria that a student could be identified as at risk. And as I said, the first 10 criteria have always been used or have been used in the recent past by KSDE, and we codified those into law. The 11th criteria that the legislature added is a new one. And so students who are identified as a student with dyslexia or characteristics of dyslexia are now identified as at risk and eligible for at-risk programs and services within districts. House Bill 2134 also made some changes to how at-risk funds and expenditures of at-risk funds and transfers into the at-risk fund must occur. Generally, all expenses that are attributable to the provision of at-risk student assistance programs have to be paid from school districts using their at-risk fund in the school district. And by law, school districts are required to transfer those monies into the at-risk fund. And in House Bill 2134, the legislature required that school districts transfer all monies that are generated by the at-risk student weighting and the high-density at-risk student weighting into that at-risk fund of the school district. Previously, that was not a strict legal requirement. School districts also can only expend funds from that at-risk fund in accordance with the law. So upon the passage of the School Finance Act back in 2017, and then through some additional revisions made through in 2019, the legislature has required that at-risk funds can only be used for, and this includes some changes in House Bill 2134 as well. These at-risk funds can only be used for at-risk and provisional at-risk programs, personnel providing educational programs in conjunction with those at-risk services or in conjunction with those programs, supports that are designed to provide training to classroom personnel related to evidence-based best practices for those at-risk educational programs, and then contracted services that provide at-risk and provisional at-risk programs. So what House Bill 2134 really did is that it allowed for the expenditure of at-risk funds and required expenditures of at-risk funds to be used for those programs and services that are only approved by the State Board of Education as a program or service that provides an evidence-based best practice for instruction of students who are identified as eligible for at-risk services. The bill requires the State Board to provide a list of the approved at-risk educational programs and services that schools can use those monies for. And the bill also, as I said, allowed school districts to expend monies on provisional programs. So if there's not a program on the State Board list, a school district can expend money on a provisional at-risk educational program as long as it's an evidence-based program or service identified by the school district that is likely to produce measurable success. And if the school district expends those funds on the provisional program, the school district must notify the State Board of that program and can only fund that program for 3 years. The State Board would then conduct a review of that program, and if it's determined that the program provides an evidence-based best practice, then the State Board would add that program to the list, and the school could continue using it along with other school districts. The bill and current law also required that school districts that receive the high-density at-risk weighting funds must expend those monies on the monies that they receive for that weighting upon the at-risk best practices developed by the State Board as well. And if they don't, they are required to repay those high-density at-risk funds into their own at-risk education fund and then expend that money in accordance with the law. The bill contemplates, and current law contemplates, that the delivery of at-risk programs and services by school districts will generally include, but is not limited to, things such as an extended school year, before school programs and services, after school programs and services, summer school, extra supports within a class, tutorial assistance, and then also class within a class. In prior to this bill, 2134, school districts have been required to report on at-risk programs and services. And generally, the report has to include the number of students who are identified as eligible for those services, the type of the services that are provided to the students, and the data and research that the school district is using to provide those services. And what House Bill 2134 added is that it also requires districts to track and report the longitudinal performance of students who are continuously receiving at-risk programs and services within the district. And if applicable, the district shall include data in their reports regarding state assessment scores, other assessment results, four-year graduation rates, progress monitoring, ACT scores, and anything of that sort on those at-risk reports. Finally, with regard to at-risk services and programs, the bill, House Bill 2134, directs the Legislative Division of Post-Audit to conduct a performance audit of at-risk education expenditures in 2023. And the purpose of this audit is to evaluate how school districts are expending their at-risk education monies, whether those expenditures comply with the law, and whether the State Board and KSD are acting in accordance with the law as it relates to those expenditures. The audit is also required to evaluate the trends in the academic outcomes of students receiving at-risk programs and services. And this audit, as I said, will be conducted in 2023, and the final audit report would be submitted to the legislature on or before January 15th of 2024. So that was House Bill 2134's at-risk provisions. Another major component of House Bill 2134 is the remote learning provisions contained within the bill. So generally, to begin, remote learning, as you all know, arose due to concerns with the COVID-19 pandemic, and it became a primary form of learning for school districts kind of during the latter part of the 2019-20 school year, and then really into the 2020-21 school year. And in that 2020-21 school year, the Kansas State Department of Education authorized school districts to utilize remote learning and provided guidance to districts regarding how such learning must be provided and documented in order for students to be counted and funded as full-time equivalent students under the School Finance Act. Generally, under House Bill 2134 and during the 2020-21 school year, remote learning it has a definition, a set definition. It's generally providing synchronous education, some level of synchronous education, and approximating the student learning experience that occurs within the classroom across that remote means. KSDE requires and required previously that students have daily meaningful contact with their teachers for the purpose of providing remote learning instruction. And I just want to also note under Kansas law, remote learning is not the same as virtual school. Even though both learning methods use virtual technology, virtual school and virtual school funding is separate, and virtual school is a method that's used to provide asynchronous learning to students, whereas remote learning is, like as I said, synchronous, and there's daily contact there with a teacher. So House Bill 2134 provided some criteria regarding remote learning, and it regulates the use of remote learning by school districts in this current school year and then moving forward. So under current law, school districts shall not provide more than a total of 40 school term hours of remote learning to any student, subject to two exceptions. The first exception is that a school district may temporarily authorize a particular student to attend school through remote learning in excess of that 40-hour limitation if such student cannot reasonably attend school in person due to an illness, medical condition, injury, or other extraordinary circumstance. So boards of education can grant this exception on an individual student basis, and they must notify the state board of any exemptions the board has granted pursuant to this section. The second exception allows a Board of Education of a school district to apply to the State Board of Education for authorization to go beyond that 40-hour limitation due to a disaster. So this would be more of a global need for remote learning at a school. So when submitting an application pursuant to this exception, the school district must certify that due to a disaster, conditions resulting from widespread or severe property damage caused by the disaster or other conditions restricting the operation of public schools will exist in the school district for an inordinate period of time. And the state board can grant that application if it determines that the school cannot reasonably adjust its learning schedule to accommodate for those disaster conditions. There's one additional way to go beyond that 240-hour limitation. The state board, again, can grant a waiver to go beyond that 240-hour limitation, but that similarly is conditioned upon a disaster in the school district. The bill and current law states that if a school district does provide remote learning in excess of that 40-hour limitation to a student, which a school district is authorized to do under current law, that student would be funded under the school finance formula as a straight flat $5,000, essentially equal to what virtual state aid funding a student receives if they were attending a virtual school. So this would be a state aid funding adjustment for those students who exceed that 40-hour limitation. So again, this law doesn't necessarily prohibit remote learning. There are avenues for school districts to use, but there is a funding adjustment if school districts use this method and are not granting individual exemptions or using the other exceptions that are available in the law. And Madam Chair, I don't know if you want me to keep going or stop for questions at any time. I'm happy to keep on trucking along.
If everyone could just hold your questions, write them down, then Nick can just continue on.
So a third thing in House Bill 2134 relates to school district attendance center needs assessments. So generally, since roughly the 2006-07 school year, each Board of Education of a school district is required to conduct an assessment of the educational needs of the attendance centers in the district and to use that information obtained from the needs assessment when preparing their school district budgets. The bill, House Bill 2134, in current law, revised the statute to require each Board of Education of a school district to use the needs assessments to prepare annual budgets that ensure improvement in student academic performance. And what current law now requires is that each Board of Education of a school district must adopt a budget for the school district that allocates sufficient monies in a manner that is reasonably calculated such that all students in the district may achieve the legislative goal set forth otherwise known as the ROSE capacities. So districts are required to conduct that needs assessment and do it in a manner to ensure that students are able to meet the ROSE capacities within the district. The fourth thing that the bill did is it added a requirement for a foster care children annual academic report card. So this is a new section of law which requires the Kansas State Department of Education and the Department for Children and Families to prepare and publish a Kansas foster care children annual academic report card. This is required to be submitted to the education committees of the House and the Senate in January of each year. And you can see on page 8 the information that it requires, graduation rates for foster care students, promotion to the next grade level, expulsions, assessment scores, other enrollment numbers, and then some de-identified race and ethnicity data for the information provided on all those identifiers. And then any other things that the department or DCF deems necessary to report to you. So that is a new requirement. The fifth thing this bill dealt with is dual and concurrent enrollment programs in high schools. So these are programs where students can enroll in both high school and college credit courses. And the bill amended this program to allow school districts at the discretion of the local Board of Education to pay all or part of the tuition, fees, and related costs for any high school student who is duly or concurrently enrolled within one of those courses. So that was the main change in that school districts can now enter into agreements with colleges to pay for that enrollment. It made some other changes, including the bill requires colleges, community colleges, and generally community colleges, but some post-secondary four-year institutions, to waive tuition and costs for foster care students that are in those programs, just like they would be waived if they were, there's a current waiver for foster care students who are attending four-year colleges at the four-year level and two-year level, rather than being in high school. The sixth thing House Bill 2134 did is it expanded the state-provided ACT and Work Keys examination program. This expansion authorized students and required the state to pay for students who are enrolled in accredited non-public schools to be able to partake in those state-provided ACT assessments, and required the Department of Education and school districts to publish information regarding where to take those ACT assessments and the ones that are offered in Kansas and pursuant to the state-provided program. And then the department is also required to prepare and submit a report that includes the exam data produced from that program. The seventh thing in House Bill 2134 is an expansion of the tax credit for low-income student scholarship program. So the bill in current law expanded the student eligibility criteria to allow a student who qualifies for reduced price meals to be eligible for a scholarship under the program. Previously, it was only free meal, so only based on that poverty basis for free meals. And then also the bill eliminated the requirement that a student has to be enrolled in one of the lowest 100 performing elementary schools, and just required that it's strictly on a poverty basis, where a student can be attending any public school and participate in the program. Finally, that 2134 is the main substantive education bill with the most substantive education provisions passed last year. House Bill 2085, I want to mention real fast, established the Students' Right to Know Act, and this requires some degree prospectus information and potential earnings information for post-secondary and post-high school earnings to be published and provided to students. And then finally, one final bill that is no longer really in effect was Senate 2021 House Substitute for Senate Bill 63, which required all school districts to provide a full-time in-person attendance option on and after March 31 of 2021, and that was only specific to last school year. And Madam Chair, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Questions, committee? Nick, actually, I do have a question about House Substitute for SB 60. Wait a minute. Nope, sorry. House Bill 2085. Okay, so remind me on this one, when we are providing this information, or KSDE is providing information to students that are graduating from schools about the degree prospectus, how are did it prescribe in law how that information is to be shared? Is it shared through just a non-interactive website where students have to find it? Or is it shared through counseling or counselors, or is it required to be sent?
So I'll have to look at the law really fast. It's 72-297. Right here in this memo, I have shall ensure that students receive this information, so it might be open-ended, but I can check on that really fast and see if the law provides any specifics.
Sure, and we do have another expert, and that's Craig. Craig, do you have the answer off the top of your head? Would you, if you do, you can come up and speak in the microphone. He yields his time. We are in Congress. Representative Estes.
Since I carried the bill, I remember the answer is we left it open-ended.
Okay, since we left it open-ended, Nick, you don't have to look for it now. Craig, would you add that to your list and provide information back to the committee on how plans are to share that information if that database is finalized, and how kids are going to know about it? That'd be great. Other questions? Representative Hoy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Question on the tax credit for low-income student scholarship program. The information received provided here talks about the performance accountability reports, and I'm trying to remember the language in the bill said accredited by the state board or national or regional accrediting agency. So if they provide a link on their webpage and there are a school, non-public school receiving these funds, would it ever be possible that when they provide that link that the school wouldn't have to have that information there if they weren't accredited through the state? Like there might not be a longitudinal report there.
So I believe the State Department, the State Board of Education would have reports for every school that's accredited by the state board. Now, I'm not sure, and we might have to ask for those participating private schools that are not accredited by the state board and maybe some national or regional accrediting organization, whether they have partaken in the state assessments and have that type of assessment data and longitudinal reports and performance accountability reports.
But so they would still have to provide a link to that page, and then people would have to look down to see whether or not a report exists on the webpage or not.
Yes, the requirement requires these qualified private schools to at least provide that link. And we'll check whether or not they have information on that page or not right now, I think.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
All right, looks like there are no further questions, so we'll go on to the next item on our agenda.
Okay, committee. This is the fun stuff for a legislative attorney right here. So Article 6 of the Kansas Constitution, and as you all know, we got, I briefly spoke on this last year, and some of you had paid attention to the interim special committee on education, or were a part of the interim special committee on education, and I spoke on this in that committee as well. But as you know, the Kansas Constitution establishes that 3 entities, governmental entities, generally possess roles in overseeing and providing for the public K-12 educational system of the state. And these are the legislature, the state board of education, and local boards of education. And this is all contained in Article 6 of the Kansas Constitution, and it sets forth the roles of those entities. Now, one thing that you need to remember, and I think is important to remember, outside of Article 6, in addition to those Article 6 powers and duties, the legislature itself is vested with the legislative power of the state pursuant to Article 2, Section 1 of the Kansas Constitution. So you, the legislature, have the power to pass, amend, and repeal laws. And as courts have said, this is an exclusive power restricted only by constitutional limitations that withhold or limit such power. And as the Kansas Supreme Court has recognized that generally the provisions of Article 6 have to be read in conjunction with that constitutional grant of legislative power. So Article 6 of the Kansas Constitution requires the legislature to exercise that legislative power to provide for the public educational system of the state. So it has both duties and obligations under Article 6 of the Kansas Constitution. For example, the first section of Article 6 requires the legislature to provide for intellectual, educational, vocational, and scientific improvement by establishing and maintaining public schools, educational institutions, and related activities. Article 6, Sections 2 and 3 also provide a duty upon the legislature, and the legislature is required to provide for the State Board of Education and the membership of the State Board of Education. And the legislature has done this through the passage of statutes establishing the general powers of the State Board and membership requirements and voting requirements to elect the State Board of Education. Article 6, Section 6, one that we've heard a lot about with Supreme Court school finance decisions, requires the legislature to make suitable provision for finance for the public educational system. And as we know, the Kansas Supreme Court in multiple decisions, and most recently in Gannon 1, held that the constitutional provision requires both an adequate and equitable school finance system. So to evaluate whether a school finance system is adequate and equitable, the court established some separate legal tests, and I'll just briefly cover those. Equity, when you're evaluating whether a school finance system is equitable, the legislature has to ensure that the school finance system provides school districts with reasonably equal access to substantially similar educational opportunity through similar tax effort. This is the legal standard set forth by the Supreme Court. So generally, when you think our state aid formulas based on tax disparities, our capital outlay state aid formula, our local option budget state aid formula. Those typically tend to be the things that are implicated in equity arguments, but there's other ways equity can be implicated as well. With regard to adequacy, to comply with the adequacy requirement, the legislature must ensure that the public education finance system, through both its structure and its implementation, is reasonably calculated to have all Kansas public education students meet or exceed the Rose capacities. These capacities, again, are codified in statute, and these provide the minimum student achievement goals of the public education system. So in Gannon 4, this was the first time the court applied the adequacy test to evaluate whether the finance system was adequate. And we have to remember this was during the Class Act. The challenge was to the block grants bill, otherwise known as the Class Act. And the court was at this stage, and it considered evidence regarding both the structure and the implementation of that school finance formula. So what it said about the structure, the court generally found that the Class Act, which was only in place for 2 set years and set to expire after 2 years, and again provided block grants, the court said that was not structurally sound, and it violated the structure component of the adequacy test because it did not profess to be a school finance formula or a long-term school finance formula, that it was responsive to financially important changing conditions such as enrollment. So what the court then went on to look at the implementation component of the formula, and the court looked at 2 different things, both the inputs and the outputs of what the education formula, what was going into it, what it was producing. So when the court was looking at the inputs, the court generally looked at the overall funding levels and what the overall funding levels were doing to the education system. It was looking at the sources of the funding. Where are these inputs coming from? The court noted that the district court should have given some more consideration to things such as federal funds coming into the educational system, CAPERS, and then also locally raised educational funds. And then the court really in this section of inputs looked at the impacts that schools stated in evidence of the funding that was being provided. And the court found that evidence showed that reductions in state funding, which began in 2009, resulted in reductions to educational programs, services, activities, staffing, and certain classes, which ended up impacting achievement of the Rose capacities. And again, in Gannon 4, the court then moved from the input side to the output side and looked at generally state assessment results to see what was being produced from the finance system. And the court found that the evidence showed that not only is the state failing to provide approximately 1/4 of all its public K-12 students with the basic skills of reading and math, but is also leaving behind significant groups of harder to educate students, those subgroups. And in my memo, you can see the charts that the court looked at and the evidence that the court looked at in the years that they were looking at with some updated assessment data. But they were looking at proficiency on state assessments on English, language arts, and math, and then the students that were deemed college or career or college ready on those assessments, based on those assessment scores. The court also looked at other outputs besides just the state assessments. They looked at ACT and NAEP scores, and they found that those scores showed achievement gaps. And then the court also took into consideration graduation rates, which showed gaps as certain student subgroups had higher percentages of students who were unable to graduate in 4 years compared to all students. So ultimately in Gannon 4, the court found that the Class Act, the school finance system that it provided was inadequate and also inequitable at the time. And so after Gannon 4, just quickly, the legislature worked on bringing the school finance system into constitutional compliance. And ultimately the legislature settled on a plan known as the Montoy Safe Harbor Plan. This plan was a 5-year funding plan that was designed to bring inflation into the school finance formula and start at the point where the school finance system was last funded at a constitutional level, which occurred after the Montoy litigation. So in Gannon 6, the court generally approved of this Montoy Safe Harbor Plan, but identified that there were some further inflationary adjustments that were necessary to be made to fully account for inflation. And after making those financial adjustments in the 2019 legislative session, the court found that the legislature had substantially complied with the court's order from Gannon 6. So currently, we've been on a 5-year base aid increase based on that Montoy Safe Harbor Plan, and the legislature is currently financing that 4th year of the plan. And then in school year 2023-2024, the legislature will complete the 5 years of phased funding increases and return the school finance system back to that level of funding that was last approved by the court as constitutional under Montoy when it has been adjusted for inflation. I just want to note that after those 5 years of phased-in funding increases, the school finance formula also requires, by statute, the state to continue to adjust that funding based upon inflation in subsequent school years. And in Gannon 7, I wanted to note that the court recognized that such inflationary adjustment would continue to provide protection for the base aid amount going forward. And again, the Gannon case has not been dismissed, as you all are well aware. The court still retains jurisdiction over that case to, as the court said, ensure continued implementation of the scheduled funding. That was a brief overview of Article 6, Section 6, legislative duties to provide adequate and equitable financing. As I said, the Constitution of the State of Kansas also confers constitutional roles upon the State Board of Education and local boards. And like I said previously, the legislative power can only be limited based on other provisions of the Constitution. So Article 6, Section 2 says that the State Board of Education shall have general supervision of the K-12 public education system. And Article 6, Section 5 provides that local public schools shall be maintained, developed, and operated by local boards of education. So in the Constitution, both entities, like the legislature, are essentially created, empowered, and obligated by the Constitution created by the people of Kansas. Thus, Article 6 requires essentially a balancing of legislative power against the constitutionally established roles of the state board and local boards. So the court has said the constitutional authority of the State Board of Education is self-executing, meaning that supplementary legislation is not required for the state board to exercise its authority. This court has held that the scope of this self-executing authority is related to the basic mission of the state board, which is to equalize and promote the quality of education through such things as statewide accreditation and certification of teachers and schools. In addition, we've had 2 Attorney General opinions that have opined on the matter, and both Attorney Generals Stephan and Attorney General Schmidt have opined that it would also be appropriate to include the establishment of minimum curriculum and graduation requirements within the scope of that self-executing state board of constitutional authority. The Supreme Court of Kansas has said a self-executing constitutional power doesn't necessarily act as a bar to legislation that falls within the scope of that power. Instead, the legislature may enact legislation to facilitate or assist in the operation of that self-executing provision, so long that as the legislation is in harmony with and not in derogation of that constitutional provision. With regard to the constitutional authority of local boards of education, the Supreme Court, the authority for them to operate their schools, the Supreme Court has said that this is not a self-executing power, meaning this authority is generally dependent upon statutory and regulatory oversight. So statutory oversight by the legislature and regulatory oversight by the State Board of Education. However, the court has suggested that the legislature does not possess complete authority over the duties and actions of local school boards, so has suggested there's some meeting and some autonomy there for local boards. And the court has said that, again, the provisions of Article 6, Section 5 and the legislative power must be read together and harmonized so both entities may carry out their respective obligations. And that legislation must not unduly interfere with or hamstring the local boards in performing their constitutional duty to maintain, develop, and operate local public schools. Madam Chair, I'll just highlight three Supreme Court cases that kind of speak to these constitutional principles. And I just wanted to note that the Kansas Supreme Court, it hasn't been very often, but the Kansas Supreme Court and, as I said, the Attorney General and Attorney General opinions have been called upon to weigh in upon whether certain legislative enactments, certain statutes, have violated or conflicted with the constitutional authority of the state board or local boards. And generally, when there is a challenge to a statute, the legislative enactment always begins with the presumption that the statute is constitutional, and all doubts are first resolved in favor of its validity. And to this date, I am not aware, we're not aware of any legislative enactment that has been declared unconstitutional under Article 6, Section 2, the state board powers grounds, or Article 6, Section 5, the local board authority. So I'll just highlight three cases. The first one is kind of the seminal case on these matters. It's the Peabody case, Miller versus the Board of Education of USD 398. This is one where the state board, this is kind of between the state board and local boards. The state board promulgated a regulation requiring each school district to adopt specific school conduct policies that were to apply to all persons employed or attending the school. The local school district argued that the state board didn't have authority to tell us, the school district, what to do here. As a school district, we've got Article 6, Section 5 authority to operate our schools, and a school conduct policy falls into that. That was the argument. The court found that the state board had that authority under its self-executing constitutional power to essentially generally supervise local public schools in that regard. The court commented that the state board's supervisory powers over local boards, the term supervision means generally something more than to advise, but something less than to control. But much depends on the context for which it is set out. And generally, the court had some language in there. It said it's upholding the regulation, finding that the regulation fell within the general supervisory powers of the state board, but it also stated that the need to educate our young persons is far too urgent a priority for the members of either the state or local boards to permit relations between them to deteriorate and become abrasive. And so the court said that type of regulation is okay, but we're kind of pumping the brakes on this a little bit. Another case, this is right within legislature versus local boards. The legislature amended the statutory procedures relating to collective negotiations between teachers and local boards. This is NEA for Fort Scott versus USD 234. The state board argued that the statutory change was unconstitutional because it usurped the state board's constitutional role under Article 6. I should say this is between the legislature and the state board. And here the court found that these collective negotiation procedures, which were statutorily provided, did not fall within the constitutional purview of the State Board of Education's general supervisory constitutional role. And because these were statutorily provided functions, and it doesn't fall within the state board's role because collective negotiations aren't one of those things: accreditation, teacher certification, curriculum, things like that. So in this case, the court found that the legislative enactment changing up some collective negotiation procedures generally comported with the Constitution and was constitutional. The final case I want to mention is Hainline v. Bond. This is the case where we get close to the state board's self-executing authority. This is a case regarding teaching certificates. So the state board suspended a teaching certificate of a teacher who was arrested and charged for burglary. And in doing this action, the state board relied on a combined interpretation of the statute regarding suspension of certificates and their own regulation regarding suspension of certificates. The statute allowed a certificate to be suspended on grounds of immorality, whereas the regulation only permitted the state board to suspend or revoke a certificate upon conviction of or a plea of guilty for a crime classified as a felony. He was suspended for an act of immorality as he later entered into a diversion agreement regarding his charges. So his argument was, under the state board's self-executing constitutional authority, the regulation should control, I shouldn't be suspended. The state board can't use that statute, it's unconstitutional. The court held that the statute that the state board relied upon was actually constitutional because the statute was not in derogation of Article 6 of the Constitution, and the statute and the regulation could be supplementary to each other, essentially harmonious to each other. And so that's one case kind of in that self-executing authority of the state board where the statute was found to be constitutional and operate in tandem with some regulations put forth by the state board. And Madam Chair, quick overview of Article 6 of the Constitution and the powers that are contained within it, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
All right, thank you very much. Good job. Committee, any questions? A lot of information. Representative Thomas does have a question.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you can answer this or not, but I'm going to ask it anyway. So with regards to authority of the school board to the state board, where would the county commission fall into place on that? So meaning mandate, school board says no, where does the authority stop there?
That's a very good question, and I know those questions are arising and have arisen. Their attorneys for school boards and county officials, I think, are evaluating that area. I mean, that where those things collide, it becomes kind of a gray area there, and where one entity's power ends and where one begins is based on both on statutory law and then also, of course, the local school board's constitutional role to operate its schools. But there's some gray area there, and I don't know that I can provide a steadfast answer on that.
What about home rule? Never mind. No, I'll retract that one. I think that's all I got. I'm sorry. Thank you, Matt.
Well, in statute, home rule would only apply to municipalities. Is that correct? Or is there in that use of that term?
Yeah, generally,
Counties do not have home rule.
Municipalities have constitutional home rule authority under the Kansas Constitution. Counties have home rule authority granted to them through a statutory operation. So they are given county home rule authority, but it's through a statute granting that home rule authority to them.
Okay, I'll ask you later about that and the differences and how that is applied. Any other questions that are related to what we're talking about today? Representative Hoy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I jotted some notes in the interim, and so I wonder if you could go into this a little bit more. I think you had touched on the separation of powers doctrine, and you had mentioned about the harmonious balance of power. So when we're looking at any statute, as you said, there haven't been any that have been determined unconstitutional. We have to make sure that our statutes do not include anything that has one branch of government usurping another branch of government. Is that the separation of powers doctrine?
Certainly, yes. And I think, as I commented during that meeting, that these cases are hinging on that kind of separation of powers. Where does one entity's authority begin? Where does one end? Where's the line drawn in that gray area? And yes, as the court has said, they've said that and commented that legislation for local boards, local public schools, legislation must not unduly interfere with or hamstring local boards in performing their duties. Similarly to the State Board of Education, that it just can't be in derogation of that provision. It can't, it can facilitate, assist in that constitutional operation, their general supervisory powers, so long as it's in harmony with and not in derogation of that provision. So that's kind of what we've got to go off of right now, I think.
Representative Hubert has a question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Nick, you and I had talked last fall about a statute in regards to infectious diseases and how that was being used by local school districts to kind of quarantine students that maybe had been exposed but were asymptomatic. Have you had any more information come out about that issue? And I would just be curious to see if anything has changed since we talked about that last fall.
I don't, Representative Hubert, the statute you're referring to is KSA 65-122, which establishes a duty upon schools and parents to exclude children who have an infectious or contagious disease, but I don't have any information to provide on that. I'd be happy
I remember you told me that it was a very old statute that probably didn't apply in the way it was being applied, but that there was no case law. And I'm imagining with what's going on in our state and country today, that issue might become more pertinent. So I would like to dig into that a little more and get your help on that. Thank you.
Yeah, and I don't know if I said anything about how it's being applied or not being applied.
You just said there was no case law that would define it.
Yeah, I didn't see any case law on 65-122 specific to that statute. And yes, it is an old statute. It was originally enacted in 1901 as part of a public health control measure. So I have done some research on it, and I'd be happy to brief the committee on that. I mean, that bill back in 1901, I'll just mention kind of an interesting thing that popped out is doctors at the time, if you had a certain contagious or infectious disease, smallpox, for example, doctors at the time, per law, were required to go place a yellow or red cloth on your door and notifying the people that you were infected. And so that law back in 1901 was pretty broad and sweeping. But yeah, I could kind of provide you some further information on that, Representative, if you would like.
I would appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative. And that is definitely a question that I've asked you a lot about. And in that particular case, schools would need to be mandatory reporters of a sick child or an infectious child. But in the case that is currently happening, it's asymptomatic. It's somebody that sat in somebody's class, may have passed by, and so it's a contact tracing issue. So I'm wondering if there's a conflict of what that is being interpreted and how it is being used, because it is not really the same, is it?
So 65-122 is the duty to exclude students who are sick. 65-118 it provides the duty upon teachers, school administrators, school nurses to report those to local health authorities. Those cases of disease or infections. So the 65-118 is the reporting requirement, 65-122 is the duty to exclude requirement that are specific to schools. And those are kind of the public health laws that are specific to schools, and then once reported to local public health, then local public health has a host of statutory authority to mitigate and control the disease.
All right, well, we'll save that for another day. Representative Estes, you get the last question, and then I have a few housekeeping items.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Page 8, paragraph C, you talk about the Supreme Court addressing certain legislative enactments and whether they conflict with the constitutional authority of the state board or local boards. And you say that the statute is subject to a legal challenge. The legislative enactment begins with the presumption that the statute is constitutional, with all doubts resolved in its favor. So currently, the legislature says you must teach math, and that's considered constitutional. So the legislature then has the authority to say, I would like you to teach computer skills. Is my interpretation of your work correct?
So I'm not going that far in this memo, providing any guidance on any statutes beyond what's been challenged here. If, for example, computer skills became a law, a requirement to teach computer skills, and it was challenged, it would begin with this presumption of constitutionality in the court. But then the court would evaluate it based on most likely this prior precedent, and evaluate whether it usurped the state board's role of general supervision. And as we saw from a couple attorney general opinions, a couple of attorney generals have opined that minimum curriculum and graduation requirements are within that state board purview. The court hasn't said that yet, but the attorney generals have said that. So that type of requirement, according to a couple of attorney generals, would be within that realm. So it would be evaluated by the court maybe a little bit more strictly, or more strictly than just a statute about teacher pay or something like that, or something that's kind of outside that state board role.
Thank you.
All right, committee, just thank you very much, Nick. We appreciate that. I'm sure there'll be future questions, and we'll get them as they come up. But committee, it was brought to my attention that on our K-12 budget rules for conferees, that it does say that they need to provide paper copies, but they do not need to provide paper copies. So I'll double check it and see if we got the right one printed, and so that would be my bad. So if there's any questions on that, we'll just update your folders. Also, our meeting times are often very packed, and we go the full amount, sometimes a little bit over. But the good news is most of the time, I would just have us meet 3 days a week. So that's good. So probably Thursdays you'll be free, at least to get us started. So if there aren't any other questions, then I will go ahead and adjourn. Have a great evening.